Leave and never return, my sister screamed. She is right, my mother added, pointing a manicured finger toward the heavy oak door. Christmas is better without your poverty dragging us down. I did not cry. I did not beg. I looked at the people who treated me like dirt, pulled out my phone, and said, "Fine, then you will not mind me doing this." 5 minutes later, they were begging me to undo the financial ruin I had just unleashed. I am Caroline, 33 years old, and a single mother to my 5-year-old daughter, Lily. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever used hidden success to crush a toxic family member. To understand how my family lost everything, we must go back 4 hours earlier. The wind was howling off Lake Michigan, whipping snow across the windshield of my old Honda Civic. I gripped the steering wheel, navigating the tree-lined streets of Chicago North Shore. In the back seat, Lily was bundled in a pink coat, singing softly, unaware of my tension. We were heading to my parents' sprawling $3 million mansion for our annual Christmas Eve family dinner. When I finally reached the familiar wrought iron gates of the estate, my stomach dropped. The circular driveway had space to fit 10 cars. Yet sitting dead center, parked horizontally across the entire entrance, was a brand new black Porsche Macan. I recognized the license plate immediately. It belonged to DeAndre, my 34-year-old brother-in-law. DeAndre was an African-American venture capitalist who married my younger sister Brittany 2 years ago. He was brilliant but arrogant, obsessed with wealth, and never missed a chance to boast about his investment fund. Parking his Porsche across the entrance was not a mistake. It was a calculated message, a reminder of my place at the bottom of the hierarchy. He knew I was arriving in a blizzard and forced me to park on the icy street outside just because he could. I parked against a snowbank, turned off the engine, and let out a steadying breath. I unbuckled Lily from her car seat, wrapped her scarf tighter around her small neck, and carefully picked up the heavy homemade cherry pie I had spent the entire morning baking. The moment I opened the door, freezing wind bit brutally into my face. I stepped out, my worn winter boots sinking straight into knee-deep snow. "Hold on to my hand tightly, baby," I told Lily, lifting her down from the car. The trek up the long, winding driveway was agonizing. The snow seeped into my cheap boots, numbing my toes almost instantly. I had to balance the fragile pie in one hand while practically dragging Lily through the heavy snowdrifts with my other hand. By the time we passed DeAndre's pristine, snow-free Porsche, my jeans were soaked up to my shins, and I could feel Lily shivering against my leg. Looking at my scuffed boots, my outdated coat, and my old car, anyone would think I was exactly what my family believed me to be: a struggling, broke single mother who had failed miserably at life. After my ex-husband, a charismatic but utterly useless freeloader, walked out on us shortly after Lily was born, my family cemented my role as the ultimate disappointment. They looked at me with a toxic mixture of pity and disgust. To them, I was just a sad charity case who completely lacked the drive to make anything of herself. What they did not know, what absolutely no one in my biological family knew, was that the struggling single mom routine was a carefully constructed disguise. I drove a 10-year-old Honda and shopped at discount department stores for a very specific reason. If my parents, William and Beverly, or my sister Brittany, ever found out how much money I actually possessed, they would stop at nothing to drain me dry. They were financial parasites, deeply obsessed with maintaining an elite wealthy image at all costs, regardless of who they had to step on to achieve it. In reality, I was the founder, CEO, and sole owner of CL Holdings, a massive international logistics corporation specializing in the secure transport of luxury goods. My company handled critical supply chain operations for some of the biggest high-end brands in the entire world. I had built a towering empire from the ground up, working grueling 18-hour days in cold warehouses while raising Lily entirely on my own. My personal net worth was well into the 9 figures, but I kept my assets safely wrapped up in blind trusts and obscure shell companies. Silence was my greatest protection against their greed. We finally reached the massive front porch of the mansion. The grand double doors were flanked by towering Christmas trees, covered in thousands of twinkling white lights. I stomped the heavy snow off my boots, trying gently to brush the melting flakes out of Lily dark hair. My fingers were stiff and aching deeply from the biting cold. I shifted the pie to my other hand and rang the heavy brass doorbell. As I stood there shivering in the freezing Chicago wind, I braced myself for the heavy emotional toll this night would inevitably take. I knew the strict rules of engagement in this house. Keep your head down. Do not react to the sharp insults. Serve the food quietly and leave early. I had played the role of the obedient, quiet failure for years, just to maintain some fragile semblance of a relationship for Lily's sake. She loved her grandparents even if they barely tolerated her. But the freezing cold seeping into my bones felt like a dark warning. The ice in the freezing winter air was absolutely nothing compared to the cruel chill I was about to face inside those doors. The heavy oak door swung inward, releasing a wave of warm air that smelled of expensive pine candles and roasted meats. Standing in the foyer was my mother, Beverly. She wore a tailored crimson dress that looked fresh off a runway, her hair immaculately styled despite the fierce blizzard raging outside. She did not reach out to hug me. She did not kneel to greet her 5-year-old granddaughter. Instead, her sharp eyes immediately darted down to our snow-covered boots and the small puddles forming beneath us on her pristine entryway floor. "Caroline, really?" Beverly sighed, her voice laced with heavy exasperation. "Could you not have stomped your feet harder outside? You are tracking freezing slush all over the imported Italian marble. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to maintain a $3 million home?" I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper. "The snow is knee-deep, Mom." DeAndre parked his car across the entire driveway. We had to walk from the street. Beverly waved a manicured hand, completely dismissing my explanation. DeAndre is a very important man with a very expensive vehicle. He cannot be expected to risk scratching a brand new Porsche by navigating it into the garage. Just take your boots off quickly. And please take that dripping coat off the child before it ruins the antique hall tree. I set the cherry pie down on a side console and knelt to help Lily. My daughter was shivering, her little fingers red from the cold. I gently unzipped her bright purple winter coat, a sensible heavy-duty jacket I had purchased on sale at a discount department store. It was warm and practical, but in my mother's eyes it was an unforgivable fashion crime. Beverly stared at the purple coat with absolute disgust. "I honestly do not understand why you insist on dressing her like a street urchin, Caroline. It is Christmas Eve. Could you not afford to buy her something presentable? At least something that does not look like it was pulled from a donation bin." "It keeps her warm," I replied evenly, keeping my voice carefully neutral as I hung the offending jacket on a brass hook. "It is perfectly fine for a snowy night." "It is embarrassing," Beverly shot back, crossing her arms. "Especially tonight. You need to understand the standard of living we are maintaining here. Just an hour ago, DeAndre gifted your sister a $15,000 Birkin bag, a rare edition. Brittany is in the parlor right now showing it to your aunts. And then you walk in, dragging a wet discount store rag across my foyer. The contrast is simply humiliating for our family image." I looked at Lily, whose large brown eyes darted nervously between her grandmother and me. She was too young to understand the brand names or the dollar amounts, but she absolutely understood the harsh tone. I placed a reassuring hand on her small shoulder. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask my mother how she could possibly compare a child's winter jacket to a luxury handbag. I wanted to ask how a grandmother could look at her shivering, sweet granddaughter and feel nothing but embarrassment over a brand name. But I remained perfectly silent. I had mastered the art of emotional restraint over the past decade. Reacting to Beverly only fueled her narcissistic fire. She fed on my supposed insecurities, using my fabricated poverty to elevate her own sense of superiority. Beverly turned her back to us, inspecting the pie I had brought with a critical eye before sighing again. "Just take the food into the kitchen and try to stay out of the way. We have guests who expect a certain level of sophistication tonight." As she walked away, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor, A cold, hard sense of irony washed over me. Beverly strutted through the massive corridors, acting like the undisputed queen of a vast, unshakable kingdom. She constantly weaponized this mansion against me, wielding its $3 million price tag as proof of her ultimate success and my ultimate failure. But Beverly was living an incredibly expensive lie. As I picked up the pie and guided Lily down the hallway toward the kitchen, I let my eyes wander over the grand, sweeping staircase, the vaulted ceilings, and the custom crown molding. I did not feel intimidated by the sheer opulence of the estate. I felt an intense, quiet satisfaction, because I knew a heavily guarded legal fact that would absolutely destroy my mother's entire reality. This magnificent $3 million mansion did not belong to William and Beverly. It belonged entirely to me. 7 years ago, my paternal grandmother passed away. She was the only person in this family who saw right through my parents' toxic image-obsessed facade. She recognized their reckless spending habits and their desperate need to appear wealthy to their country club friends. Before she died, she secretly changed her will. Instead of leaving the family estate to her son, my father William, she placed the entire property into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. And she named me as the sole beneficiary. My parents had no idea. The lawyers who executed the trust were bound by strict confidentiality agreements, instructed to allow my parents to continue residing in the home under the guise of an ongoing estate probate process. As long as they paid the property taxes and basic maintenance, they were permitted to stay. But they did not own a single brick, a single pane of glass, or a single slab of that imported Italian marble Beverly loved to boast about. They were essentially my non-paying tenants, squatters living in a fantasy world entirely at my mercy. I had kept this massive secret hidden for years, waiting for the right moment. I allowed them to treat me like a peasant in my own castle because the legal leverage gave me an immense sense of security. Every time they insulted my car, my clothes, or my career, I found comfort in knowing I held the deed to the very roof over their heads. I could legally evict them with a 30-day notice whenever I chose. Tonight, as I watched Beverly flaunt her fake wealth and mock my beautiful daughter, that 30-day notice felt closer than ever. I squeezed Lily's hand gently, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. I promised myself that I would not let them ruin her Christmas. I would endure their vicious remarks, stay perfectly composed, and play the role of the impoverished daughter for just a little while longer. The foundation of their arrogant empire was built on quicksand, and I was the one holding the shovel. We pushed through the swinging door into the massive gourmet kitchen. The counters were piled high with unprepared ingredients. Raw vegetables, unseasoned roasts, and empty serving platters cluttered every single inch of the marble countertops. My father William stood near the double ovens holding a crystal glass of bourbon. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. He did not bother to say hello to his granddaughter. "Caroline, you are late," William snapped, checking his gold Rolex. "The extended family will be arriving in exactly an hour. We have 15 people expecting a full holiday feast. Put the child in the den and get an apron on immediately." I looked at the mountain of raw food. "You want me to cook all of this by myself? Where are the caterers?" William scoffed, taking a slow sip of his drink. "We canceled them." Brittany felt that a home-cooked meal provides a much warmer holiday aesthetic for her social media updates. "Since you are not contributing financially to this family, the absolute least you can do is handle the kitchen duties. Do not burn the prime rib. DeAndre has very specific tastes." William did not offer a single word of gratitude. He expected my subservience as payment for simply allowing me to breathe the same air as his successful guests. He turned his back on me and walked out, leaving me alone with a kitchen disaster. I pulled up a wooden stool for Lily, gave her some crackers to snack on, and tied a linen apron around my waist. I grabbed a chef knife and started chopping onions. I was entirely unfazed by the manual labor. Hard work was exactly how I built my empire, but the blatant disrespect, the absolute entitlement to my time and energy fueled a quiet rage burning deep in my chest. Through the open archway connecting the kitchen to the grand living room, I had a perfect view of my sister and her husband. Brittany was lounging on a plush velvet sofa, taking 100 selfies with her new $15,000 handbag. DeAndre was standing by the roaring stone fireplace, holding a dark green bottle of Dom Perignon. He popped the cork with a loud cheer, pouring the expensive champagne into crystal flutes for my parents and aunts. They clinked their glasses together, laughing wildly. The stark contrast was sickening. I was relegated to the role of the unpaid help, sweating over a hot stove, while the golden child and her husband were treated like absolute royalty. "Listen up, everyone," DeAndre announced, his booming voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I have some massive news, a little early Christmas present to myself." My parents leaned in eagerly, hanging on to his every word, as if he were a prophet delivering sacred wisdom. DeAndre puffed out his chest, adjusting his designer cashmere sweater. "Tomorrow morning, my new venture capital logistics startup is officially closing our Series A funding round. We are securing a massive $10 million capital injection from a top-tier institutional investor. This money is going to revolutionize the global luxury supply chain. We are integrating AI-driven tracking for high-value assets. It is next-level stuff. By next year, I will be running the entire logistics market in the Midwest." William patted DeAndre aggressively on the back. "That is my son-in-law, a true visionary, the pride of this family." Beverly clapped her hands together, practically swooning. $10 million. Oh, DeAndre, you are simply a genius. Brittany is so incredibly lucky to have a man who understands how to build real wealth. I kept my head down and continued chopping celery. My knife hit the wooden cutting board in a steady, rhythmic motion. A logistics startup. A supply chain revolution. I knew the luxury logistics industry better than anyone on the planet. I knew every bottleneck, every tariff, every major shipping route. And listening to DeAndre throw around corporate buzzwords like a freshly graduated business student was almost comical. A few minutes later, DeAndre strolled into the kitchen. He was holding his empty champagne flute, looking for the ice bucket. He stopped by the island, leaning heavily against the marble as he watched me furiously chopping vegetables. He let out a loud, mocking sigh. "Well, look at this. The family Cinderella hard at work. Do not forget to scrub the pans when you are done, Caroline." I kept my eyes focused entirely on the cutting board. "Just getting dinner ready, DeAndre." He chuckled, swirling the last few drops of champagne in his glass. "You look exhausted, Caroline. Honestly, it is sad. A woman your age should have a career, a husband, some kind of stability. Instead, you are chopping onions and relying on my father-in-law for pity." It got me thinking about you while I was talking about my $10 million deal. I heard you are still moving boxes at that dead-end warehouse job. Is that right? Still wearing a hard hat and sweating for pennies? "I am in logistics," I replied smoothly. "We move products." DeAndre laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "That is cute. You call lifting cardboard boxes logistics. Listen, since the holidays are about charity, I might be able to help you out. When my $10 million wire transfer hits my account tomorrow, I am going to need to hire some grunt workers. Let me know if you need a minimum wage packing gig. I could probably pull some strings and get you a job taping boxes together. It pays better than whatever pathetic warehouse you are rotting in right now." I paused my chopping. I looked up and met his arrogant, condescending gaze. The sheer audacity of this man was staggering. He stood in my house drinking champagne my parents bought with money they did not have, mocking me for working in the exact industry I secretly dominated. "I appreciate the generous offer," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I will definitely keep your $10 million project in mind tomorrow." DeAndre smirked, completely oblivious to the cold threat hidden behind my words. "You do that. Just try not to get grease on the dinner plates. We have a lot to celebrate tonight." He turned and sauntered back into the living room, laughing loudly as he rejoined Brittany by the fire. I looked back down at the pile of chopped vegetables. My daughter Lily pulled on my apron strings, her innocent eyes looking up at me. "Mommy, why is that man so mean?" she asked softly. I wiped my hands on a clean towel and gently stroked her dark hair. "Because some people think money makes them important, sweetie. But do not worry. Tomorrow he is going to learn a very hard lesson about how the world really works. I turned my attention back to the stove. The rage that had been simmering inside me was now a razor-sharp, hyper-focused weapon. DeAndre thought he was a titan of industry. He thought he had the entire world at his fingertips. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had absolutely no idea who was truly funding his arrogant lifestyle. DeAndre's laughter echoed down the hallway, blending seamlessly with the clinking of crystal glasses and the sycophantic praise of my parents. I stood completely still in the kitchen listening to the muffled sounds of their celebration. The anger that had previously tightened my chest slowly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. I reached for a damp towel and meticulously wiped the flour and vegetable juice from my hands. Every deliberate movement grounded me. I crouched down to check on Lily, who was happily munching on her crackers and coloring on a piece of scrap paper. I kissed the top of her head, ensuring she was entirely insulated from the toxic atmosphere radiating from the living room. Once she was settled, I walked over to my battered discount store purse, sitting on a far counter. I unzipped a hidden interior compartment and pulled out my secondary device. It was a sleek, matte black smartphone entirely devoid of any identifying logos. This was not the cracked, outdated phone I let my family see. This device ran on a heavily encrypted network, connecting me directly to the executive suite of CL Holdings. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner and entered a complex alphanumeric passcode. The screen unlocked, displaying a sterile, highly secured dashboard. I opened my email client, navigating past dozens of high-level supply chain reports and international shipping manifests. I was looking for a specific correspondence from my chief financial officer, Harrison. He had messaged me earlier that afternoon regarding an upcoming venture capital acquisition, but I had been too busy dealing with the snowstorm and the pie to review the details. I tapped on the encrypted message flagged with high priority. Harrison was requesting my final authorization on a Series A funding round for a promising Midwest logistics startup. My venture capital division had identified the startup as a potential acquisition target to absorb smaller regional delivery routes. Our corporate strategy frequently involved pumping capital into ambitious young firms, scaling them up, and eventually integrating their tech into our global infrastructure. It was standard business procedure, something my lower-level executives usually handled until the final signing stage. I read through Harrison's executive summary. The startup was seeking exactly $10 million to integrate an artificial intelligence-driven tracking system for high-value assets. These were the exact same corporate buzzwords DeAndre had just spouted in my parents' living room minutes ago. My eyes narrowed. I scrolled past the financial projections, the risk assessment matrices, and the market analysis directly to the principal founder information. There, glowing brightly on the high-definition screen of my encrypted phone, was the name DeAndre Washington, founder and Chief Executive Officer of Apex Freight Solutions. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time, letting the magnitude of the revelation sink into my bones. The massive institutional investor DeAndre had been bragging about the shadowy corporate entity that was about to crown him the king of Midwest logistics was none other than CL Holdings. He was bragging about my money. Because my holding company operated through a complex web of subsidiaries and anonymous corporate officers, DeAndre had no idea who actually sat at the top of the pyramid. He had pitched his business to my directors, shaken hands with my vice presidents, and signed term sheets drafted by my legal department. He had absolutely no clue that the ultimate benefactor he was relying on was his impoverished sister-in-law. Every single word he had spoken in this house was a testament to his own blinding arrogance. The truth was, my company did not even need his startup. We acquired companies like his for spare parts, dismantling them to streamline our own massive internal operations. I scrolled further down the digital document to the execution requirements. The term sheet had been negotiated, the due diligence was completed by my analysts, and the contracts were fully drafted. However, due to the sheer size of the capital injection company policy, mandated a final manual authorization from the majority shareholder. The $10 million wire transfer was scheduled to execute at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, but the transaction was currently locked in a pending status. At the very bottom of the screen, a blinking green icon awaited my input. It required my unique digital signature to release the funds to Apex Freight Solutions. Without my explicit authorization, the wire transfer would automatically fail. The startup would default on its aggressive expansion contracts, their operational capital would dry up instantly, and DeAndre would face immediate corporate bankruptcy. His reputation in the competitive venture capital world would be permanently destroyed before it even truly began. I looked down at my hands. They were raw from washing heavy pots covered in baking flour and smelling of chopped onions. I was standing in a kitchen relegated to the role of a domestic servant by a family that viewed me as an absolute failure. Yet hidden within the palm of my hand, I held the entire financial destiny of the man who had just offered me a minimum wage job packing cardboard boxes. The sheer poetic irony was intoxicating. DeAndre was currently standing less than 50 feet away from me wearing designer cashmere, drinking expensive champagne and mocking my existence. He believed he was a brilliant titan of industry. He thought he had conquered the business world by securing capital from an elite, faceless corporation. He had absolutely no idea that the supreme authority of that corporation was currently basting a holiday roast in his mother-in-law's kitchen. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. I was no longer the victim of their relentless emotional abuse. I was no longer the scapegoat sister forced to endure endless humiliation for the sake of keeping the peace. I was the silent architect of their reality. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger is an unpredictable, messy emotion. What I felt now was absolute terrifying control. I possessed the ability to let DeAndre reach the absolute pinnacle of his arrogant dreams, or I could snap my fingers and watch his entire empire crumble into dust before he even had the chance to sit on his imaginary throne. I tapped the screen of my phone, keeping the authorization page open, but leaving the signature box completely blank. I locked the device and slipped it back into the hidden compartment of my purse. I tied my apron a little tighter, picked up my chef knife, and turned back to the cutting board. When I walked out into the dining room later to serve them dinner, I would not shrink under their judgmental stares. I would not lower my eyes when they insulted my clothes or my lifestyle. I would look directly at DeAndre, and I would smile. Because there is a very specific type of peace that comes from knowing you hold a $10 million guillotine directly over your abuser's head, just waiting for the perfect moment to drop the heavy blade. The kitchen was suffocatingly warm, the heavy scent of roasting garlic and rosemary doing nothing to mask the bitter reality of my situation. I finished chopping the final batch of root vegetables and wiped the excess moisture from the granite counter. Down by my feet, Lily was happily oblivious to the hostility radiating from the next room. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. She had commandeered a blank piece of printer paper and a handful of crayons I kept in my purse for emergencies. "Is that a masterpiece?" I asked softly, forcing a genuine smile for her sake. Lily looked up, her dark eyes shining with pure innocence. "It is a Christmas tree. I made it for Aunt Brittany. I put a big gold star on top so she will like it." My heart physically ached inside my chest. Lily was far too young to grasp the toxic status-obsessed dynamics of this family. She did not understand that love in this house was entirely transactional. She just saw an aunt who never paid any attention to her, and she wanted to win her affection the only way a 5-year-old knew how. I hesitated, my maternal instincts screaming at me to take the drawing and distract her. I knew exactly how Brittany would react, but stopping Lily meant crushing her sweet, generous spirit before she even tried. "It is beautiful, sweetie," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Walk slowly, okay? The floors are slippery." Lily beamed, clutching the drawing proudly in her small hands. She trotted out of the kitchen, her little boots tapping against the hardwood, before transitioning to the grand living room marble. I followed a few steps behind her, wiping my flour-coated hands on a kitchen towel, keeping a watchful, protective eye on her every movement. In the living room, the atmosphere was thick with arrogance. Brittany was holding her new Birkin bag up toward the light of the roaring stone fireplace, tilting her hip, while DeAndre snapped dozens of photos on his latest smartphone. Beverly and William were seated opposite them on the plush velvet armchairs, swirling their champagne and admiring the gross display of wealth. "Aunt Brittany, look!" Lily called out, her voice cutting through the pretentious chatter with bright, unfiltered joy. She stepped eagerly toward the edge of the expensive sofa, holding the paper out with both hands. "I made a Christmas card for you." Brittany snapped her head down, her perfectly contoured expression, instantly twisting into a mask of absolute revulsion. She looked at the piece of paper as if my daughter were offering her a handful of toxic waste. Lily took one more eager step forward, the edge of the drawing brushing ever so slightly against the fabric of Brittany's designer outfit. "Watch it!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. Her arm lashed out in a sudden aggressive motion. She forcefully swatted Lily's small hands away, treating my child like a filthy stray animal. "You will get cheap crayon dust on my silk dress." The physical force of the swat was entirely unnecessary and shockingly violent. Lily, already unbalanced by her heavy winter boots, stumbled backward from the impact. Her small feet slipped on the highly polished Italian marble. She fell hard, her elbow striking the unforgiving stone floor with a sickening thud. The handmade Christmas card was knocked violently from her grasp, tearing straight down the middle as Brittany's manicured fingernails caught the edge of the paper. For a split second, the grand living room was dead silent. The crackling of the fireplace suddenly sounded deafening. Then Lily let out a sharp gasp, followed by a piercing, heartbroken wail. She clutched her bruised elbow, her little face crumpled in pain and profound confusion as she stared up at the aunt she had just tried to please. I froze. The cold, calculated peace I had established in the kitchen shattered into a million jagged pieces. It was instantly replaced by a blinding, white-hot maternal fury that roared through my veins like wildfire. But before I could even take a single step forward, my parents reacted. They did not rush to comfort their crying, injured granddaughter. They did not reprimand Brittany for physically striking a 5-year-old child. Instead, Beverly let out a loud, dramatic sigh of extreme inconvenience. "Caroline, get in here and control your child!" Beverly demanded, slamming her crystal wine glass down onto a silver coaster. "This is exactly why we hesitate to invite you to these formal gatherings. She has absolutely no high-class manners, running around a formal sitting room like a wild animal." William adjusted his expensive silk tie and glared at me with pure disgust. "Get her off the floor right now. She is making a ridiculous scene over absolutely nothing. Brittany's dress is custom-made. If that child ruined the fabric, you are paying the dry cleaning bill, Caroline." DeAndre chuckled, not even bothering to look up from his phone as he continued swiping through the photos he had just taken. "Maybe teach the kids some basic boundaries. You cannot just go grabbing at high-net-worth items with unwashed hands." The kitchen towel slipped from my fingers, landing softly on the floor. I walked into the living room. The air around me seemed to freeze, the temperature in the room plummeting to absolute zero. I did not yell. I did not curse at them. I simply walked straight past my father, past my mother, and past DeAndre's arrogant face. I knelt down on the cold marble floor. I gently scooped Lily into my arms, cradling her against my chest. She buried her tear-streaked face into my neck, her small body trembling with quiet, gasping sobs. I kissed her forehead, rubbing her bruised elbow with a fiercely soothing touch. "I have got you, baby," I whispered softly into her hair. "Mommy is right here. You are okay." With my free hand, I reached out and picked up the 2 torn halves of her Christmas drawing. The bright yellow star she had colored so carefully was ripped entirely in half. I folded the torn paper deliberately and placed it deep into my pocket. I stood up slowly, holding my daughter securely against my hip. I turned my head and locked eyes with Brittany. She was busy smoothing out an imaginary wrinkle on her silk dress, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just assaulted her own niece. Then I looked at my parents. William and Beverly were staring back at me with expressions of supreme annoyance, waiting impatiently for me to apologize for the disruption. They fully expected me to lower my head, scurry back into the kitchen, and resume my place as their obedient, worthless servant. My eyes turned to pure, unadulterated ice. The line had been crossed. Mocking my clothes was one thing. Insulting my career and my intelligence was something I could easily ignore. But physically harming my innocent child and then blaming her for bleeding onto their pristine artificial world was the absolute point of no return. Any lingering shred of familial obligation I held in my heart died on that marble floor. I tightened my grip on Lily. The time for playing the silent, struggling victim was officially over. I was going to burn their entire financial empire to the ground, and I was going to make sure they watched every single ash blow away in the freezing Chicago wind. I stood up, smoothed my apron, and carried the heavy platters out to the dining room. The mahogany table was set for 15, sparkling with crystal. I arranged the prime rib and the roasted vegetables I had spent hours preparing. My aunts, uncles, and cousins filed into the room, their voices a chorus of forced holiday cheer. They took their designated seats, leaving exactly one chair open for me. It was positioned at the furthest edge of the table, right next to the drafty swinging door that led to the kitchen. The icy wind hit my back, a physical reminder of my place in this hierarchy. I sat down quietly, eyes fixed on my plate. At the center of the table, commanding the room like royalty, sat Brittany and DeAndre. DeAndre was holding court, regaling my gullible aunts with exaggerated tales of his venture capital conquests. Brittany leaned against his shoulder, ensuring everyone got a perfect view of the new designer handbag resting on the chair beside her. My mother, Beverly, beamed at them, her face glowing with a toxic mixture of pride and greed. My father, William, sat at the head of the table, pouring expensive wine and laughing too loudly at DeAndre's jokes. I chewed my food mechanically, keeping the explosive secret of my identity tucked safely away. Just as the plates were cleared, William stood up. He picked up a silver butter knife and tapped it sharply against his crystal wine glass. The ringing sound cut through the chatter, instantly silencing the room. All eyes turned to the head of the table. William adjusted his expensive suit jacket, puffed out his chest, and looked down the table with utmost self-importance. He let his gaze rest squarely on DeAndre. "Family!" William began, his voice dripping with theatrical emotion. "Christmas is a time for reflection and for looking toward the future. For years, Beverly and I have worked tirelessly to build the prestige of this family name. We have always prayed for a legacy we could be proud of. Tonight, our prayers have been answered." William raised his glass toward DeAndre. "DeAndre, when you married Brittany, we did not just gain a son-in-law. We gained a true partner. You are a visionary, a man who understands the ruthless nature of success. You are the pride and savior of the family legacy." DeAndre smirked, raising his own glass in a lazy salute, but William held up his hand, demanding absolute silence. "And because we believe in your vision so fiercely," William continued, his voice echoing in the dining room, "Beverly and I have decided to do more than offer emotional support. A man like DeAndre is closing a massive $10 million funding round tomorrow morning. That kind of corporate momentum requires family backing. So as a surprise Christmas gift, Beverly and I have officially secured a $2 million bridge loan to inject directly into Apex Freight Solutions. We are joining the funding round. We are going to be partners in this empire." The room erupted in gasps and applause. My aunts whispered excitedly about the sheer wealth on display. DeAndre looked surprised, his arrogant facade breaking into a greedy smile. William beamed, soaking in the admiration, but a sharp, terrifying realization struck me like a physical blow. A $2 million bridge loan. My parents did not have $2 million in liquid assets. They lived entirely on credit and appearances. There was only one way a bank would approve a cash loan of that magnitude for a retired man with no steady income. William confirmed my darkest suspicion in his very next sentence. "We went to the bank on Thursday," William boasted proudly, completely unaware of the legal avalanche he was inviting. "We put this very house up as collateral. When you have a $3 million North Shore estate, banks are happy to leverage the equity. We bet the roof over our heads on you, DeAndre. That is how much faith we have in your logistics revolution." The applause faded into a dull, muffled ringing in my ears. I stopped breathing. The fork slipped from my fingers, clattering loudly against my porcelain plate. I stared at my father, my mind racing through a million terrifying legal calculations per second. He used the house as collateral, the house that did not belong to him. The house locked inside a heavily fortified, irrevocable trust bearing my legal name. For William to legally encumber the property, the bank would require the signature of the primary title holder. They would need my signature. My parents had not asked me to sign anything. They had not even mentioned the bank. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My parents had forged my signature. They had fabricated a power of attorney or falsified the trust documents to convince a commercial lender to hand over $2 million. This was not just toxic family behavior anymore. This was mortgage fraud. This was identity theft. This was federal wire fraud. My parents had literally committed multiple federal felonies, risking decades in a federal penitentiary, all to blindly fund the arrogant man sitting across from them. They had stolen my property, placed a massive financial lien against my hidden assets, and handed the stolen cash directly to a man who had just assaulted my daughter. I sat frozen at the drafty end of the table, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany wood so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. Panic threatened to consume me, but years of running a billion-dollar corporation had trained me to process chaos rapidly. I absolutely needed to verify this immediately. If the stolen funds had already been wired, my property was officially compromised. I took a slow, deep breath, burying the rising panic under a thick layer of cold, ruthless executive logic. I slipped my hand deep into my pocket, slowly feeling the sleek, heavy metal of my encrypted business phone. I slipped my phone out of my pocket, hiding the glowing screen beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. The dining room around me faded into a dull hum. My father was still talking, his voice booming as he detailed the financial maneuvering required to secure the bridge loan. Every word he spoke was a confession to a federal crime, delivered loudly over roasted vegetables and expensive wine. I kept my face perfectly blank. A sudden shift in my expression would alert them, and I needed absolute secrecy to execute what had to come next. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of my secure device. The screen unlocked instantly. I bypassed my corporate email and opened the encrypted financial portal linked directly to my wealth management firm. My grandmother had established the property trust with ironclad protections. To leverage the North Shore estate, my parents would have needed my physical signature, a notarized proof of identity, and a certified power of attorney. William and Beverly had bypassed all of that. They must have found a corrupt notary or fabricated the legal stamps themselves. I navigated through the secure banking app, my thumb moving with practiced precision. I tapped into the specific portfolio housing the property trust. The loading wheel spun for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the numbers appeared on the screen. There it was, a massive glaring red alert in the asset column. A pending lien had been registered against the estate property just 48 hours ago. The encumbrance was logged by a commercial lender based in downtown Chicago. The exact amount was $2 million. The status read as pending final disbursement. The funds were queued in an escrow account scheduled to be released to Apex Freight Solutions first thing tomorrow morning. I stared at the glowing numbers in the palm of my hand. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. This was not a simple family dispute over holiday dinner. This was a calculated, premeditated financial attack. Under United States federal law, forging signatures to secure a commercial loan constituted severe mortgage fraud and wire fraud. They were looking at mandatory minimum sentencing if federal authorities got involved. My parents had risked spending the final decades of their lives in a federal penitentiary just to appease the ego of a man who openly mocked their own flesh and blood. I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked down the length of the mahogany table. William was pouring himself another glass of wine, his chest puffed out with absolute pride. Beverly was leaning over, patting DeAndre on the shoulder, treating him like a conquering hero. Brittany was absorbed in taking photos of her new designer bag, completely oblivious to the fact that her parents had just mortgaged their freedom to fund her lavish lifestyle. They all believed they were untouchable. They believed they had successfully scammed the system, secured their fortune, and solidified their high-class status. But they had made a fatal error. They had handed the stolen money to a company that I was secretly evaluating for acquisition. They had tied their entire criminal conspiracy directly to my corporate empire. The air in the dining room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I took a slow sip of my ice water, letting the cold liquid wash down my dry throat. The dynamics of the evening had irrevocably changed. I was no longer the abused daughter sitting in the drafty corner of the room. I was a victim of a massive financial crime, and I was the only person in the room with the power to stop the transaction before it became irreversible. DeAndre slammed his hand on the table, drawing my attention. He was laughing loudly at a joke my uncle had just made. This $2 million injection from William and Beverly is exactly what Apex needs to trigger the $10 million corporate match tomorrow, DeAndre boasted, waving his fork in the air. The institutional investors wanted to see strong internal capital before they released the final wire. We checked all their boxes. By noon tomorrow, we will have $12 million ready to deploy. I watched him speak. He was so incredibly confident. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of stolen money and forged documents. And the entity holding the final $10 million piece of that puzzle was me. I realized in that exact moment that I could not simply walk away from this family. Walking away meant letting them steal $2 million of equity from my daughter's future. Walking away meant letting a man who assaulted a 5-year-old child walk away with a massive fortune. I had to destroy the transaction. I had to freeze the assets, alert the authorities, and tear down the illusion they had so carefully constructed. I had the technological capability to freeze the bridge loan through my private banking contacts, and I had the absolute authority to cancel the corporate venture capital funding with a single click. I glanced at Lily, who was sitting quietly in the den just beyond the dining room archway. She was rubbing her bruised elbow, trying to remain invisible so her aunt would not yell at her again. The sight of her small hurt frame hardened my resolve into solid steel. I was going to let them finish their dinner. I was going to let them revel in their imaginary victory for a few more minutes. I wanted them to feel the absolute highest peak of joy and arrogance before I systematically dismantled their entire world. My father looked down the table and caught my eye. He offered a condescending smile. "Do not look so miserable, Caroline," William said loudly, ensuring the entire table could hear him. "Maybe DeAndre will let you invest a few $100s of your warehouse salary into his company." The table erupted into polite, mocking laughter. I did not break eye contact with my father. I smiled back, a calm, terrifyingly hollow smile that he was too foolish to understand. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Dad," I replied, my voice steady and clear over the laughter. "I am definitely going to take a very close look at his company." I took a slow, deliberate bite of prime rib and smiled. The meat was perfectly tender, but I tasted nothing. My mind was already leagues ahead, drafting the exact digital commands I would execute to bring this arrogant family to their knees. The countdown had officially begun. The clinking of silverware against fine china resumed, but the atmosphere in the dining room had shifted. My father had claimed his moment of glory, and now my mother Beverly refused to be outdone. She reached for her crystal champagne flute and tapped it elegantly with her manicured fingernail. The sharp, clear chime demanded absolute attention. The low murmur of conversation from my aunts and uncles immediately died away. Beverly stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her designer dress. She carried herself with the practiced grace of a seasoned socialite preparing to deliver a keynote address. She looked around the long mahogany table, ensuring every single pair of eyes was fixed directly on her before she began to speak. "William is absolutely right about the importance of legacy," Beverly announced, her voice projecting effortlessly across the room. "We have spent decades cultivating our position in this community. We have built a name that commands respect and opens doors. But preserving an empire requires more than just financial savvy. It requires the courage to make incredibly difficult, sometimes painful family decisions." I sat perfectly still at the drafty end of the table. I knew exactly where this was going. This was the second act of their twisted holiday performance. They had already elevated DeAndre to the status of a financial god. Now they needed a sacrifice to complete the ritual. They needed to publicly execute my remaining dignity. Beverly clasped her hands together in a gesture of fake theatrical sorrow. As parents, William and I have always tried to provide equal opportunities for our daughters. We gave them both the finest education, the best social connections, and every advantage a young woman could possibly ask for. But eventually, you have to accept that some investments simply do not yield a return. She turned her head and locked her cold, calculating eyes on me. The entire room followed her gaze. 15 pairs of eyes stared at me, a mix of pity, discomfort, and morbid fascination. "We must direct our legacy to the successful side of the family," Beverly stated, her voice hardening into ice. "Caroline has been a profound disappointment. She has refused to apply herself. She has failed to secure a stable partnership, and she insists on dragging her feet in a dead-end warehouse job. We have given her chance after chance to improve her station in life, but she has flatly refused to rise to our standards." A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the dining room. Even my most gossip-hungry aunts looked down at their plates, visibly uncomfortable with the sheer brutality of a mother publicly tearing down her own daughter on Christmas Eve. Therefore, Beverly continued, raising her chin with supreme arrogance. "William and I have officially updated our estate planning. We have met with our attorneys and formally removed Caroline from our family will. We cannot allow her lack of ambition to drain our resources. We cannot let her drag Brittany and DeAndre down. Everything we have built, our entire estate, will be left exclusively to Brittany and her husband to ensure the preservation of our family empire." Brittany let out a soft, delighted gasp, pressing her hand against her chest, as if she had just won an Academy Award. She leaned over and kissed DeAndre on the cheek. Brittany leaned back in her chair, running her fingers over the smooth leather of her new Birkin bag. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, the kind of smile a predator gives a trapped animal. "I hope you understand," Caroline Brittany chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "This is really for the best. You have always struggled to manage your finances. Leaving you a massive inheritance would just be a burden. You are much better off living a simple, stress-free life." DeAndre nodded in agreement, leaning his elbow on the table. "Exactly. Wealth management requires a certain caliber of intellect. You just stick to baking your little pies and let the adults handle the family portfolio." The urge to laugh out loud burned the back of my throat. The irony was so thick I could practically chew it. They were lecturing a corporate CEO about wealth management. They were talking to a woman who routinely moved hundreds of millions of dollars across international borders before breakfast. I was currently deciding whether or not to destroy DeAndre's entire venture capital firm with a single swipe of my thumb, and they were telling me I was incapable of managing money. Beverly remained standing, staring at me. She was waiting. She was waiting for the tears. She was waiting for me to jump up from my chair, to beg for forgiveness, to plead for my rightful share of the inheritance. She wanted a dramatic, humiliating breakdown that would validate her decision and prove to the entire room that I was emotionally unstable and entirely dependent on her mercy. I gave her absolutely nothing. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not even break eye contact. I sat completely motionless, my hands resting lightly on my lap, and I stared back at her with a deadpan, eerie silence. The sheer absolute absurdity of her announcement was staggering. Beverly and William were publicly disinheriting me from an estate that possessed literally zero assets. They were drowning in consumer debt. They had zero retirement savings. They had just committed federal mortgage fraud to secure a high-interest bridge loan against a property they did not even own. Their grand family empire was a massive, rotting sinkhole of financial liabilities. They were officially cutting me out of a negative net worth while standing inside a $3 million mansion that legally belonged to me. They were acting like ruthless monarchs guarding a treasure vault, completely unaware that the vault was empty and I owned the entire castle. The silence stretched on for 10 agonizing seconds, then 20. The lack of a reaction began to unnerve the room. My aunts shifted nervously in their velvet chairs. My uncle coughed awkwardly into his napkin. Beverly's triumphant smile began to falter. Her eyes darted rapidly, searching my face for any sign of devastation. When she found none, a flash of genuine confusion washed over her features. She expected a victim, but she was looking at a predator who had already won the war. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Caroline Beverly demanded, her voice losing its theatrical polish and edging into desperate frustration. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining my cold, unwavering stare. My voice, when I finally spoke, was so calm and detached it sent a visible chill down the table. "I think you have made the perfect decision, Mother," I replied smoothly. "Directing your legacy exactly where it belongs is the smartest financial move you have ever made." "I completely agree with your assessment." Beverly physically recoiled, stepping back as if she had been struck. She had brought a knife to a gunfight entirely unaware that the battlefield was already rigged with explosives. She slowly sat back down in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wineglass. She had delivered her ultimate crushing blow, and I had simply brushed it off my shoulder like a piece of meaningless lint. The air in the room grew heavy and suffocating. The grand disinheritance had failed to produce the satisfying drama my parents craved. Instead, it had exposed their cruelty to the extended family and left them grasping for control. I turned my attention back to my dinner plate, cutting a small piece of meat with absolute precision. The game was escalating exactly the way I needed it to, and the final pieces were sliding perfectly into place. DeAndre leaned back in his ornate dining chair, shifting his weight with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he had just conquered the entire world. The heavy silence in the room following my mother's failed disinheritance announcement clearly bothered him. He was a man who craved constant applause, a narcissist who fed on the visible submission of those he considered beneath him. My eerie lack of an emotional breakdown had robbed him of the entertaining spectacle he felt entitled to watch. If Beverly could not break me, DeAndre was determined to step up and deliver the final crushing blow himself. He let out a low, patronizing chuckle that vibrated through the quiet dining room. He slowly reached inside the breast pocket of his custom-tailored blazer and pulled out a thick, jet-black crocodile skin wallet. The designer logo gleamed under the light of the crystal chandelier overhead. Every single movement he made was deliberately slow and agonizingly theatrical, designed to draw the maximum amount of attention from my extended family sitting around the mahogany table. He wanted every set of eyes fixed entirely on his display of wealth. He flicked the wallet open with a quick, arrogant snap of his wrist. I watched as his manicured fingers pulled out 5 crisp, brand-new $100 bills. He did not simply hand the cash to me. He placed the bills inside a small, embossed white envelope he had likely brought for a holiday tip for a valet driver or a coat check attendant. He tapped the envelope against the polished wood of the table, making sure every aunt, uncle, and cousin was watching his grand display of absolute financial superiority. He was establishing himself as the new king of the family, and I was the peasant he was choosing to publicly humiliate. With a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face, DeAndre pressed his index finger against the envelope and slid it slowly down the length of the dining table. The white paper glided over the polished mahogany, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch from my dinner plate. "Do not cry, Caroline," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with venomous mocking pity. "I know tonight has been hard for you to process. Watching us secure millions while you get cut out of the family legacy has to sting. But I am a generous guy. Take this as a Christmas gift from Brittany and me. Buy yourself and the kids some decent winter clothes. Try not to spend it all at Walmart." Brittany let out a sharp, cruel laugh, covering her mouth with a hand adorned in sparkling, oversized diamonds. William and Beverly exchanged approving nods, clearly viewing DeAndre's degrading stunt as an act of noble, high-class charity. My aunts looked away, their faces flushed with second-hand embarrassment, completely unwilling to intervene and risk the wrath of the new family patriarch. No one dared to defend me. They were all complicit in this toxic performance. The envelope sat there on the dark wood, a stark white rectangle representing everything this toxic family stood for. It was a physical manifestation of their arrogance, their cruelty, and their desperate need to diminish me to elevate themselves. They measured a person's worth exclusively by the brand names on their clothing and the balance in their checking account. Anyone else in my position would have exploded. A normal, struggling single mother would have stood up, grabbed the envelope, and thrown it directly into DeAndre's smug face. She would have screamed at him to keep his dirty charity. She would have stormed out of the dining room in a fiery blaze of humiliated rage. That was exactly the reaction DeAndre wanted. He wanted to be the wealthy savior bestowing pennies upon the ungrateful, hysterical failure. He was begging for a reaction that would prove his ultimate dominance. But I was not a normal, struggling single mother. I was a billionaire CEO sitting across from a man who was entirely dependent on my corporate approval to avoid total bankruptcy by tomorrow morning. I stared down at the crisp white envelope. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating. DeAndre raised a single eyebrow, waiting for my inevitable explosion. I let him wait. I let the absolute quiet of the room press down heavily on his chest. I let the tension build until the air in the dining room felt so thick it was difficult to breathe. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the agonizing seconds. Slowly, deliberately, I reached my hand out toward the envelope. A collective silent gasp rippled through my extended family. They could not believe their eyes. They watched in sheer, horrified fascination as I picked up the $500. I held the envelope between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the thick, expensive paper. I did not rip it up. I did not throw it back. I calmly folded the envelope in half, pressing the crease down with absolute precision, and slipped it deep into the pocket of my cheap discount store cardigan. I raised my head and locked my eyes directly onto DeAndre. I did not offer him a polite thank you. I did not look away in shame. Instead, I gave him a razor-thin, completely hollow smile. It was the kind of smile a predator gives right before the steel trap snaps shut. It was a smile devoid of any warmth, any fear, or any submission. It was pure distilled ice. DeAndre's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. My complete lack of humiliation genuinely confused him. He had just handed a woman a humiliating handout in front of her entire family, and she had pocketed the cash with the serene confidence of a monarch collecting a petty tax from a disobedient subject. He shifted uncomfortably in his ornate chair, his eyes darting away from my unwavering gaze for a brief moment before he forced his arrogant smirk back into place. I patted my pocket gently, feeling the folded envelope resting against the fabric. $500 was absolute pocket change. It was less than a rounding error on the daily interest my personal accounts accrued. But taking his money was a strategic necessity. By accepting his insulting charity without a fight, I was cementing his delusion of absolute power. I was letting him climb to the very highest peak of his towering arrogance. The higher DeAndre climbed, the harder the sudden catastrophic drop was going to feel. He had just essentially tipped the executioner right before his head was placed on the chopping block. I kept my eyes fixed on him, my razor-thin smile never wavering. The storm was coming. The crushing, destructive force of a $10 million financial collapse was currently sitting in the palm of my hand, waiting for the perfect trigger. The dining room remained eerily quiet, the calm before the absolute devastation. I picked up my wine glass, took a slow, methodical sip of the cheap red wine my parents had served me, and waited for the final spark that would ignite the inferno. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the opulent dining room, illuminating the holiday feast. Conversation slowly resumed a forced murmur, attempting to smooth over the awkwardness. I kept my posture straight, my breathing slow and measured. Next to me, my 5-year-old daughter Lily sat perched on a heavy wooden dining chair, her small legs swinging silently above the floor. She had been incredibly patient all evening, enduring the tense atmosphere and the unfamiliar food my mother had served. I cut her roast beef into tiny squares, but she barely touched it, her appetite ruined by the overwhelming hostility in the room. The seating arrangement placed us at the very edge of the family circle. The table was fully extended to accommodate 15 guests, so the corner where we sat wrapped slightly around the end. This positioned DeAndre directly to my left, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. He was leaning back, legs crossed, aggressively displaying his custom Italian suede loafers, the very shoes he had boasted about earlier. They were a pristine tan color, a physical testament to his obsession with material wealth. In the center of the table, resting on a silver platter just out of my immediate reach, sat a woven basket filled with warm dinner rolls. It was the only thing Lily actually wanted to eat. She had been staring at the basket for the past 10 minutes, her small stomach undoubtedly rumbling. I was momentarily distracted, my eyes locked on Beverly as she signaled an aunt to pour more wine. In that brief moment of diverted attention, Lily decided to be a brave big girl and get a piece of bread all by herself. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, stretching her small torso over the edge of the mahogany table. Her little arm reached out across the expanse of white linen, navigating past a maze of fine china and tall glassware. She was trying so incredibly hard to be very careful, her tongue poking out in deep concentration. But she was only 5 years old, and the table was crowded with the chaotic debris of a massive family dinner. As her tiny fingers brushed against the edge of the woven bread basket, the oversized sleeve of her discount purple sweater snagged the rim of a massive crystal water goblet. The glass had been filled to the brim with ice water by my father just moments before. It happened in an agonizingly slow motion. The heavy crystal tipped outward, losing its center of gravity. Lily gasped and tried to pull her arm back, but it was too late. The glass hit the mahogany table with a loud, ringing thud. A tidal wave of freezing ice water flooded across the white linen tablecloth. The liquid rushed toward the edge of the table, forming a waterfall that cascaded directly off the side. Gravity pulled the freezing water straight down, splashing onto the pristine hardwood floor. But it did not just hit the floor. 4 distinct freezing drops of water landed precisely on the toe of DeAndre's custom Italian suede loafers. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. DeAndre leaped backward, as if he had been struck by lightning. His heavy dining chair scraped violently against the floorboards, letting out a sharp, ear-piercing screech that silenced the entire room. He looked down at the tiny dark water spots blooming on his pristine tan suede, and his face contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. "Are you kidding me?" DeAndre roared, his booming voice vibrating the crystal glasses on the table. He glared down at my terrified 5-year-old daughter, his eyes burning with a disproportionate, monstrous rage. "You stupid, clumsy little brat. Do you have any idea how much these shoes cost? These are custom imported suede. Water ruins them instantly." Lily shrank back into her chair, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Her bottom lip began to quiver. DeAndre did not stop. He stepped closer, looming over her small frame like a towering, aggressive shadow. "What is wrong with you?" he yelled, hurling curses that echoed loudly in the formal dining room. "You cannot sit at a table without destroying thousands of dollars of property. This is exactly why you do not belong here. You and your pathetic mother drag your cheap, filthy habits into my space and ruin everything you touch." I was already moving my chair, pushing back my hands, reaching out to shield my daughter from his verbal assault. But before I could pull Lily into my arms, the situation escalated from verbal abuse to physical violence. Brittany, furious that her perfect holiday dinner was being interrupted, leaned across the corner of the table. Her face was flushed with ugly, entitled rage. She did not offer a napkin. She did not try to calm her husband down. Instead, she locked her eyes on Lily's small, trembling hand, the hand that was still resting near the edge of the table where the glass had fallen. "You need to learn a hard lesson about touching things that do not belong to you," Brittany hissed. She brought her hand down with vicious, intentional force. The sharp, stinging crack of skin hitting skin echoed through the completely silent dining room. Brittany had physically smacked my 5-year-old daughter. She hit her small hand hard enough to leave a bright, angry red mark across her delicate skin. For one fraction of a second, the universe stood completely still. Then Lily let out a high, piercing scream of pure pain and absolute heartbreak. The hot tears she had been fighting back broke free, and she began to wail, clutching her stinging hand to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. My father did not reprimand his daughter. My mother did not comfort her sobbing granddaughter. They just sat there watching the scene with cold, judgmental annoyance that my daughter was crying too loudly. The final spark had just truly ignited the burning inferno. I completely abandoned the strict, rigid rules of engagement I had followed for my entire adult life. The exact moment the sharp crack of Brittany's hand against my daughter's skin echoed through the dining room, the carefully constructed dam inside me completely obliterated. I moved with a speed and ferocity born of pure primal maternal instinct. My dining chair crashed backward onto the hardwood floor as I lunged across the table. I grabbed Brittany by the shoulders of her expensive silk dress. I shoved her backward with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. I wanted her away from my child immediately, and I did not care what broke in the process. Brittany shrieked as her stiletto heels slipped on the wet marble floor. She lost her balance, her arms flailing wildly as she crashed backward into the heavy mahogany dining table. The impact was violent and loud. Her elbow caught the edge of the embroidered table runner, dragging it downward. Half a dozen crystal wine glasses tipped over, shattering into jagged pieces across the floorboards. Dark red wine splashed heavily across her pristine white dress and splattered against the expensive custom wallpaper. The sound of breaking glass and Brittany's dramatic wailing filled the room, replacing Lily's terrified sobs with absolute, unadulterated chaos. My aunts jumped up from their velvet chairs in genuine shock. "Are you out of your mind?" DeAndre roared. He stepped aggressively over the shattered crystal, his massive frame completely blocking the warm light from the overhead chandelier. He stepped into my personal space, looming over me like a towering, furious shadow. His chest puffed out, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He tried to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me into fearful submission. I felt the intense heat radiating from his furious face as he screamed, "You do not ever touch my wife. I will throw you out into the freezing snow myself, you absolute psycho." I did not flinch or back away. I stepped firmly in front of Lily, shielding her small, trembling body entirely behind my legs. I tilted my chin up and locked my eyes directly onto DeAndre. He expected me to cower under his towering aggression, but I looked at him with an unflinching intensity that made him momentarily pause. "Touch me," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating whisper that cut through the noise of the room. "Raise one single finger toward me or my daughter, and I promise you will not have a hand left to sign your precious venture capital checks tomorrow morning." Before DeAndre could process the veiled, icy threat, the rest of the dining room exploded. I expected my father to intervene. I had expected my mother to rush forward and comfort her crying granddaughter. I was incredibly foolish to expect basic human decency from people whose hearts were made of cold, hard cash. "Caroline, what is wrong with you?" William bellowed, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of purple. He marched down the long table, carelessly kicking aside the broken glass. "Look at what you have done to this dining room. Look at your sister. You are completely unhinged." Beverly rushed to Brittany's side, frantically fussing over the dark wine stains. She completely ignored the fact that her golden daughter had just struck a 5-year-old child. "You are insane!" Beverly shrieked, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You have always been so incredibly jealous of your sister. You have always tried to ruin her special moments. To physically attack her over a spilled glass of water is absolute lunacy." Beverly continued, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "You are a bitter, jealous woman, and you are traumatizing everyone in this house with your violent outbursts." I stared at my parents, the absolute absurdity of their reaction hitting me with sickening force. "She hit my child," I yelled, my voice finally rising above the chaotic din of the dining room. "Your golden daughter just physically struck a 5-year-old girl over a few drops of water, and you are screaming at me about a stained dress and broken glass. Are you completely out of your minds?" Brittany dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the victim with theatrical, sickening perfection. "She was ruining DeAndre's custom shoes," Brittany sobbed, clinging tightly to my mother's arm. "I just tapped her hand to teach her a basic lesson. Caroline is a violent psychopath who attacked me for no reason." A tap, I shot back, my blood boiling hotter than a furnace. There is a bright red welt across her hand. "You laid your hands on my innocent daughter because your arrogant husband cares more about his Italian suede loafers than a human being." William slammed his heavy fist down on the only clear section of the mahogany table, rattling the remaining silverware. "That is enough," he commanded, his voice trembling with sheer authoritarian rage. "DeAndre is the most important person in this room tonight. He is the brilliant future of this family. We are not going to let your pathetic, deep-seated jealousy and your unruly child sabotage this crucial celebration. You have completely lost your mind, Caroline. William continued, his eyes glaring at me with absolute contempt. You have crossed a line you can never ever come back from. We tolerate your presence out of sheer charity, and this is how you repay us, by assaulting your sister and disrespecting the man who is bringing millions into this family. The battle lines were permanently drawn. There was no more gray area, no more pretending to be a family, no more enduring the relentless abuse for the sake of holiday peace. The fragile familial bonds did not just gently fray over time, they violently, irrevocably snapped in that dining room, right before my eyes, leaving absolutely nothing but an empty, echoing void where my biological family used to be. The ultimate confrontation had finally arrived. Brittany pushed herself away from the damaged mahogany table, her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. The dark red wine dripped from her ruined silk dress, staining the pristine white carpet beneath her feet. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. Her chest heaved with heavy, furious breaths as she looked at me and my terrified daughter with absolute unmasked disgust. "Take your bastard child and get out of my house!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing violently against the vaulted ceilings. "Leave and never return!" The sheer venom in her words hung heavily in the freezing air of the dining room. She had crossed the ultimate unforgivable line. Calling my innocent 5-year-old daughter a bastard was the final devastating blow to whatever fragile illusion of a family we had left. Brittany stood there, breathing hard, looking around the room as if expecting a round of applause for her extreme cruelty. She got exactly that from our mother. Beverly stepped forward, moving to stand right beside her golden daughter. She wrapped a fiercely protective arm around Brittany's shoulders, completely validating the horrific insult that had just been hurled at my child. Beverly glared at me with eyes so cold and devoid of maternal warmth that they barely looked human. She looked at me the way one might look at a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. "She is right," Beverly sneered, her voice laced with absolute terrifying conviction. "Christmas is so much better without your poverty and failures dragging us down. Get out." William immediately stepped up to join them, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of hostility. He crossed his arms over his expensive, custom-tailored suit, puffing out his chest to assert his dominance. "I am not going to tell you again, Caroline." William bellowed, his face still flushed a mottled purple with rage. "You have completely ruined this holiday. You have assaulted your sister, insulted my son-in-law, and brought nothing but absolute shame into this dining room. Pack up your pathetic little coat and leave my property immediately, or I will personally call the police and have you escorted off the estate for trespassing." DeAndre stood just behind my father, a smug, deeply victorious grin spreading across his arrogant face. He adjusted his designer watch, clearly reveling in the chaotic spectacle playing out before him. He firmly believed he had just won the ultimate victory. In his mind, he had successfully purged the one embarrassing stain from their flawless high society canvas. He looked at me as if I were a diseased insect that had finally been swept out the front door. "Take the $500 I gave you and go find a cheap motel." DeAndre mocked, his deep voice carrying easily over the dead silence of the extended family. "Or better yet, just sleep in that rusted-out piece of junk you parked out on the street. It is exactly where people like you belong. Tomorrow morning, I am waking up $10 million richer, and you are going to be right back at the bottom of the food chain where you started. Do not ever think you can step into my world and challenge me again." The extended relatives sitting around the shattered dining table remained completely silent. My aunts and uncles simply stared down at their half-eaten plates of prime rib, completely complicit in this brutal, heartless banishment. Not a single person offered to help Lily. Not a single person suggested that throwing a single mother and a young child out into a raging sub-zero blizzard on Christmas Eve was an act of supreme, unforgivable evil. They had made their choice. They had aligned themselves with the promised wealth of DeAndre's venture capital firm and the fabricated prestige of my parents' $3 million mansion. They had all placed their bets on the wrong horse. My parents and my sister stood tall, their shoulders pushed back, their chins raised high in the air. They were absolutely drunk on their own perceived power. They genuinely believed they had successfully banished the family scapegoat forever. They thought they had completely protected their precious elite reputation from my contagious poverty. They felt utterly invincible, shielded by their expensive clothes, their stolen bridge loan, and their grand stolen house. In their twisted narcissistic reality, this was their triumphant climax. They had crushed the rebellious, ungrateful daughter and secured their glorious financial future in one swift move. They firmly believed that tomorrow morning would bring them the ultimate corporate victory, cementing their status as the most powerful family in the Chicago North Shore. They felt untouchable. I stood silently, holding Lily tightly against my side. I looked at the four of them standing shoulder to shoulder in their arrogant, unified front. William, the fraudulent patriarch; Beverly, the cruel status-obsessed mother; Brittany, the violent, spoiled princess; and DeAndre, the pompous, oblivious fool. They looked so incredibly proud of themselves. They had absolutely no idea that they were standing directly on a trapdoor, and they had just willingly handed me the heavy iron lever to pull it open. Every single cruel word they had just spoken was the final nail in their collective coffin. Any tiny lingering shred of hesitation I might have harbored about destroying my own biological relatives evaporated into the freezing air. They had asked for total war. They had demanded my permanent exile. They had chosen to weaponize their fake wealth against my innocent child. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I did not feel a single drop of rejection, sorrow, or despair. The emotional nadir they were desperately trying to force upon me simply did not exist. Instead, a massive wave of profound, chilling clarity washed over my entire body, sharpening my focus to a razor edge. I had given them every possible opportunity to show a basic shred of human decency, and they had spectacularly, unforgivably failed the test. They wanted me to leave their house. They wanted me to disappear into the blinding blizzard and never return. They wanted to enjoy their stolen wealth and their fake empire in absolute peace. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the freezing air deep into my lungs to steady my racing heart. The time for playing the helpless victim was permanently over. The countdown had reached absolute zero. It was time to give them exactly what they asked for and watch them choke on the devastating consequences. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not fall to my knees and beg for my family to reconsider their brutal banishment. The desperate, hysterical reaction they were holding their breath to witness simply never materialized. Instead, the air around me seemed to crystallize, freezing over with a profound, terrifying stillness. The chaotic noise of the dining room, the shattered crystal on the floor, my father's heavy breathing, Brittany's dramatic sniffles faded into a dull, distant hum. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, I crouched down to my daughter's eye level. I picked up her bright purple winter jacket from where it had fallen on a nearby chair. "Come here, Lily," I whispered softly, making sure my voice held absolutely no trace of fear. "We are going home now." I guided her small arms into the sleeves of the discount store coat. I methodically zipped the heavy nylon fabric all the way up to her chin, ensuring she was completely protected from the brutal Chicago blizzard raging outside those walls. I wrapped her knitted scarf tightly around her neck and pulled her woolen hat over her ears. My movements were mechanical, practiced, and devoid of any panic. Every zip, every tug of fabric was a silent countdown to their absolute destruction. The grand mahogany dining table behind me was completely silent. My extended family watched in utter disbelief as I calmly prepared my child for the harsh winter night. My absolute silence unnerved them deeply. It was the chilling, unnatural calm of an ocean retreating right before a massive tsunami hits the shore. I stood up slowly, keeping Lily safely tucked behind my right leg. I turned around to face the furious, arrogant room. My eyes swept across the faces of the people who shared my blood. I looked at William, whose chest was still puffed out in a pathetic display of fraudulent authority. I looked at Beverly, whose hands were resting proudly on her hips as she guarded her vicious golden child. I looked at Brittany, whose ruined silk dress was a perfect metaphor for her decaying soul. Finally, my gaze locked onto DeAndre. He was still wearing that smug, triumphant smirk, firmly believing he had just eradicated a minor inconvenience from his path to immense wealth. He had absolutely no idea that he was staring directly into the eyes of his executioner. My expression was completely dead. There was no anger left, no sadness, no lingering trace of familial affection. I looked at them with the chilling, detached calculation of a corporate apex predator evaluating a completely worthless asset. The room held its breath, waiting for my parting words. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout over the crackling fireplace. I let the absolute silence stretch out until the tension was suffocating. "You want me to leave?" I asked, my voice carrying the lethal razor-thin precision of a scalpel. "Fine. Then you will not mind me doing this." I reached into the deep pocket of my cheap worn cardigan and bypassed the envelope of $500 DeAndre had thrown at me like garbage. My fingers wrapped around the heavy matte black casing of my encrypted corporate smartphone. I pulled it out and held it up. The device was sleek, completely devoid of any brand logos, and practically radiated high-level executive authority. It was a piece of technology that cost more than DeAndre's custom Italian suede loafers, designed exclusively for secure billion-dollar financial transactions. DeAndre's smirk faltered slightly. His eyes narrowed, trying to process why the impoverished sister-in-law he had just banished was holding a piece of military-grade corporate hardware. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The dark screen instantly illuminated, casting a cold blue light across my face. I bypassed the standard security protocols and opened the CL Holdings executive portal. The interface was entirely stripped down, displaying only the most critical, high-level corporate functions. I navigated directly to the Venture Capital Acquisitions tab. My thumb hovered over the screen, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. I opened the pending transactions ledger. At the very top of the list, glowing in bright white text, was the $10 million capital injection destined for Apex Freight Solutions. The entire future of DeAndre's logistics empire was sitting right there, waiting for my final corporate authorization to clear the banking sweep at dawn. The sheer magnitude of the power I held in that single moment was absolute. With one tap, I could make DeAndre the king of the Midwest supply chain, or I could erase his entire existence from the corporate map. I stared at his arrogant face one last time, memorizing the exact contours of his unearned confidence. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his digital execution warrant was actively glowing in the palm of my hand. I lowered my eyes back to the illuminated screen. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single drop of remorse for the devastation I was about to unleash upon this house. I pressed the first button on the command dashboard. Cancel funding transfer. The system immediately generated a secondary prompt demanding a mandatory corporate justification for terminating a fully negotiated capital injection at the final hour. A drop-down menu appeared on the screen. I scrolled past market volatility and insufficient capital reserves. I tapped directly on the most severe, legally destructive option available in the corporate registry: reason fraudulent conduct. The screen flashed bright red, requiring a final confirmation to permanently kill the $10 million wire transfer. I pressed confirm. The loading icon spun for exactly 1 second before a large, solid green checkmark appeared on the screen. The transaction was officially dead. The money was permanently locked back inside the CL Holdings corporate vault. The venture capital deal that William and Beverly had mortgaged their fake mansion to support was completely irrevocably pulverized. I locked the encrypted phone and slid it smoothly back into my pocket. The execution was entirely silent, completely bloodless, and absolutely fatal. I stood holding my daughter's hand, waiting for the digital shockwave to hit. It would only take a few seconds for the automated banking systems to notify the recipient of a catastrophic funding failure. The absolute silence in the room was about to be shattered. Exactly 30 seconds passed. I counted each one in my head, feeling the steady rhythmic thumping of my own pulse. The absolute silence in the dining room stretched tight, feeling like a heavy piano wire ready to snap under the immense pressure. William took a step forward, his chest puffed out again, ready to deliver his final booming command to throw my daughter and me out into the freezing snow. Brittany crossed her arms, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her meticulously made-up face. DeAndre leaned back against the edge of the shattered mahogany table, casually adjusting the French cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt. He looked entirely triumphant, like a conquering king surveying his newly acquired, deeply inferior subjects. He opened his mouth, drawing a breath to deliver one last patronizing insult to hasten my departure. Then his cell phone rang. The sound was a harsh, sharp blare that violently pierced the quiet tension of the room. It was not a standard generic text notification. It was the customized, highly urgent ringtone he had explicitly assigned to his executive management team. DeAndre let out a heavy sigh of theatrical annoyance, rolling his eyes dramatically at the sudden interruption. He reached into his designer blazer and pulled out the latest flagship smartphone, glancing lazily at the caller ID. A wide, incredibly arrogant grin immediately spread across his face. "It is my chief financial officer, DeAndre," announced loudly, ensuring the entire extended family could hear his every word. "They are probably calling to celebrate the early clearing of our venture capital funds. Watch and learn, William. This is what true high-level corporate success actually sounds like." He swiped the glass screen to answer the call and pressed the speaker icon, holding the phone out into the center of the room so everyone could bask in his glorious moment. "Yeah, Marcus," DeAndre said smoothly, his voice dripping with supreme, untouchable confidence. "Tell me the good news. Are we officially the undisputed kings of the Midwest logistics market, or what the voice that erupted from the speaker was not celebrating?" It was a raw, terrified scream of pure, unadulterated panic. "DeAndre, what the hell did you do?" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking violently with pure hysteria. The audio crackled harshly from the sheer volume of his screaming. "What did you do to them?" "The corporate portal just locked me out entirely. The entire dashboard is flashing red. The capital injection is completely gone." DeAndre's arrogant smile instantly vanished. His posture stiffened rigidly, the phone trembling slightly in his large hand. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice dropping a full octave in sudden alarm. "Stop panicking like a child and speak clearly. The $10 million transfer is scheduled to clear tomorrow morning. The escrow accounts are permanently locked." "It is not locked." Marcus practically sobbed through the speaker, the sound of hyperventilation echoing in the dining room. "It is completely dead. The anchor investor just pulled the entire $10 million. The transaction was manually aborted 3 minutes ago. I just received the automated termination notice from the Central Banking Authority. They completely killed our deal." The air was instantly sucked out of the grand dining room. My aunts and uncles gasped in unison, clutching their napkins. William froze in his tracks, the aggressive color completely draining from his face. Beverly gripped the edge of her velvet chair, her knuckles turning stark white. Brittany dropped her hands to her sides, staring at her husband in absolute unblinking horror. "That is physically impossible," DeAndre roared, abandoning his calm, collected demeanor entirely. He started pacing frantically back and forth across the shattered crystal scattered on the hardwood floor. $10 million does not just vanish into thin air. We have signed corporate term sheets. We have binding legal contracts. They cannot just pull the funding without triggering a massive multi-million-dollar legal penalty. "They can if they trigger a breach clause," Marcus yelled back, his panic escalating into full-blown terror. "I am reading the official termination notice right now. The funding was canceled under a penalty-free withdrawal clause. The specific reason listed on the banking sweep is fraudulent conduct." "DeAndre, what is going on over there? Did you lie on the financial disclosure forms? Did you forge the compliance records to pass the audit? They flagged us for massive fraud." "I did not forge anything," DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. The veins in his neck were bulging aggressively against his tight collar. Heavy beads of sweat began to form on his forehead, rolling down his temples and instantly ruining his pristine high society appearance. "Call the bank right now. Call the investment brokers. Call absolutely anyone. We desperately need that money to clear by dawn." "You do not understand," Marcus cried, sounding exactly like a man standing on the very edge of a towering cliff. "It is already way too late. We leveraged absolutely everything based on that $10 million guarantee. We signed the massive warehouse expansion leases this morning. We authorized the new fleet vehicle purchases an hour ago. The automated supplier payments are scheduled to hit our operating accounts at exactly midnight. Without the venture capital injection to cover those massive liabilities, every single operational check is going to bounce incredibly hard. DeAndre abruptly stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, his wide chest heaving violently as he gasped for air. He was visibly hyperventilating, his eyes wide and wild, like a trapped animal facing a predator. He reached up and violently yanked his expensive silk tie loose, clawing frantically at his collar, as if he were suddenly suffocating in the drafty room. If those checks bounce, we immediately default on all of our expansion contracts. DeAndre stammered, his voice shrinking into a terrified, breathless whisper. Yes, Marcus screamed in sheer agony. We breach every single operational contract simultaneously. The corporate accounts will be severely overdrawn by millions of dollars. The creditors will aggressively seize everything we own by tomorrow afternoon. We are bankrupt, DeAndre. We are instantly, catastrophically bankrupt. The entire firm is completely dead. DeAndre dropped heavily to his knees right there on the wet, wine-stained floor. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the wood, but the speakerphone remained active. He clutched his chest, gasping desperately for oxygen, his eyes darting frantically around the silent room as his massive, fragile empire disintegrated into absolute ruin in real time. Who did this? DeAndre gasped, directing his desperate, pleading question to the phone lying on the floorboards. Who has the authority to kill a finalized $10 million corporate transfer with one single click? Find out who killed my company. There was a moment of heavy, terrified silence on the other end of the line, broken only by the rapid sound of Marcus typing furiously on a mechanical keyboard. Then a sharp, horrifying gasp came through the tiny speaker. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered, his voice completely drained of all remaining hope. "I am looking at the final authorization ledger." The rejection did not come from a low-level risk manager. It came from the absolute top of the pyramid. Who? DeAndre screamed, slamming his heavy fists into the floorboards with crushing force. Who killed the deal? It was CL. Holdings! Marcus screamed back, his voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings of the mansion. The CEO pulled it personally. DeAndre remained on the floorboards, staring at nothing. The smartphone slipped from his trembling hands, bouncing against broken crystal. The invincible venture capitalist was ruined. I stepped over spilled wine, locking eyes with William and Beverly. They had watched DeAndre collapse, but their arrogant minds had not processed reality. They still believed they were shielded by their own financial maneuvers. William cleared his throat, projecting authority. "Get up," DeAndre William ordered. "This is simply a clerical error. The bank flagged a processing code. Do not panic over a glitch. Our $2 million bridge loan hits your operating accounts tomorrow. We secured the capital against this estate. Our legacy is funding your expansion, so call your brokers back." Beverly nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. William and I took care of the primary capital. The house provides more than enough equity to sustain your logistics company until the institutional investors fix their software problem. We are the ultimate safety net." Their delusion was breathtaking. They clung to a bridge loan secured by committing federal mortgage fraud against their daughter. They had no idea their safety net was suspended over an active volcano, and I held the detonator. I retrieved my corporate smartphone. The blue screen illuminated my face. I opened a highly encrypted application. This was my direct line to the Executive Wealth Management Division of my private bank, a portal granting immediate access to federal fraud prevention systems. I stared at William, memorizing his arrogant sneer. He thought he was the powerful patriarch saving the day. He thought his fraudulent signature had cemented his status as a kingmaker. I pressed the second button, initiating a high-priority corporate fraud protocol. The system requested confirmation to flag the pending $2 million bridge loan. A drop-down menu appeared. I selected forged documentation and unauthorized encumbrance of a protected trust. The application flashed a severe yellow warning. Confirming this specific alert would instantly freeze all associated commercial and personal accounts linked to the fraudulent signatories. The automated system would immediately generate a formal report to the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding high-dollar mortgage fraud. I did not hesitate. I pressed my thumb against the screen to confirm the biometric authorization. The system processed the command instantly. The yellow warning vanished, replaced by a solid red screen confirming the federal alert was deployed. The digital trigger was pulled. I lowered the phone and slid it back into my pocket. The silence in the room stretched for exactly 12 agonizing seconds. Suddenly, William's suit jacket began to vibrate aggressively. A sharp, piercing alarm tone erupted from his chest pocket. It was the harsh sound of an extreme banking alert. He frowned, pulling the device out. The moment his eyes focused on the bright screen, the arrogant color instantly drained entirely out of his face. His jaw dropped open. Before William could process the notification, Beverly's designer purse began to ring with the exact same terrifying alarm. Then the phones of every single aunt and uncle who shared joint family accounts or business ties with my father started buzzing in a horrific, synchronized chorus of financial doom. William stared at his screen, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the device. "What is this?" he gasped, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "What is happening to the accounts?" Beverly frantically dug her phone out of her purse. Her manicured fingers swiped at the screen. "William," she cried out, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "The bank is sending automated messages. My primary checking account is locked. The joint savings account is completely frozen. The platinum credit cards are declining. They shut down everything. Read the primary email." William choked out, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He frantically scrolled through a lengthy message that had just hit his inbox from the commercial lender. Read the legal notice from the fraud department. Beverly opened the message. Her eyes scanned the text rapidly, and then her entire body went rigid. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She read the words aloud, her voice trembling so hard it broke on every single syllable. "Dear William and Beverly," she whimpered, reading directly from the glowing screen. "This is an urgent automated notification from the Central Fraud Prevention Division. The $2 million bridge loan scheduled for disbursement tomorrow morning has been permanently suspended." William let out a choked gasp, clutching his chest. "The property title holder has flagged the collateral authorization as highly fraudulent." Beverly continued reading, tears of pure terror streaming down her ruined makeup. "All personal business and joint accounts linked to your Social Security numbers have been instantly frozen pending a federal investigation. Due to the extreme severity of the forged signatures regarding the North Shore Property Trust, our compliance department has forwarded this entire file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The phone slipped from Beverly's hand, crashing onto the hardwood floor next to the broken crystal. She stared at William with wide, unblinking eyes. "The FBI," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of air. "William, the bank just reported us to the FBI for federal mortgage fraud." The domino effect struck with brutal precision. In under 60 seconds, William and Beverly went from boasting about their magnificent wealth to staring directly down the terrifying barrel of a massive federal indictment. They suddenly realized they were entirely broke. They had zero access to any cash, their credit was completely obliterated, and federal agents would be knocking on their door by morning to arrest them for forging documents on a $3 million estate. William looked up from his phone, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at the opulent dining room, the expensive chandelier, and the fine china. The foundation of his fake, arrogant existence was completely unraveling into nothingness right before his terrified eyes. The crushing weight of reality finally crashed down upon their shoulders. They had absolutely nothing left. DeAndre stared at the black smartphone resting lightly in my palm. The devastating audio from his panicked business partner still echoed in his ringing ears. The CEO pulled it personally. His bloodshot eyes slowly traveled up my cheap, flour-stained cardigan, past my plain collar, and finally locked onto my face. The absolute realization hit him like a physical blow. He saw the cold, unyielding authority radiating from my posture. He saw the exact same digital interface on my screen that his financial team used to access their funding portal. "How did you do this?" DeAndre gasped, his voice trembling as he struggled to push himself up from the wine-soaked floorboards. He pointed a shaking finger at my device. "Who are you?" I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood perfectly straight. The drafty air from the kitchen door no longer bothered me. I looked down at the man who had mocked my existence, insulted my career, and violently assaulted my 5-year-old daughter. "My name is Caroline," I said, my voice carrying the absolute booming authority of a corporate titan. "I am the founder, chief executive officer, and sole owner of CL Holdings." The sheer magnitude of the revelation dropped over the dining room like a massive concrete block. Brittany gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. William and Beverly froze, their terrified minds struggling to comprehend the impossible words leaving my mouth. DeAndre shook his head frantically, his brain refusing to process the catastrophic truth. "No, that is completely impossible. CL Holdings is a global luxury logistics empire. It is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You work in a filthy warehouse. You pack cardboard boxes for minimum wage." "I own the warehouses, DeAndre," I corrected him smoothly. "I own the shipping fleets. I own the international distribution networks. I own the highly secured vaults that store the luxury goods you so desperately worship. And as of yesterday afternoon, I owned the exclusive venture capital division that was prepared to hand you $10 million to fund your pathetic amateur logistics startup." DeAndre's jaw dropped. The last remaining drops of arrogant color vanished from his face. "I negotiated your Series A funding round," I continued, stepping closer to him, forcing him to look up at the woman he had just publicly humiliated. "My analysts reviewed your financial projections. My legal team drafted your compliance contracts. When you were bragging to my family about revolutionizing the supply chain with artificial intelligence tracking systems, you were literally reciting the exact business model my company pioneered 5 years ago. You came to my corporation begging for a financial lifeline, and you had absolutely no idea that the billionaire holding your entire future in her hands was standing right here cooking your Christmas dinner." DeAndre staggered backward, his legs giving out as he crashed heavily into an empty dining chair. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a raw, guttural sob of absolute defeat. His empire was officially dead slaughtered by his own blinding arrogance. He had handed a $500 charity envelope to a woman who possessed enough liquid capital to buy his entire existence 100 times over. William, completely unable to accept the total destruction of his family hierarchy, stepped forward. His hands were still shaking from the FBI fraud alert, but his ingrained narcissism demanded he fight back. "You are lying!" William shouted, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic anger. "You are a complete failure. You do not have billions of dollars. If you did, you would not be driving a rusted-out car and dressing your child in cheap rags. You are making this up to terrorize us. You cannot do this to us in our own house. I am going to call the police and have you arrested for hacking our bank accounts." I turned my gaze away from DeAndre and locked eyes with my father. The sheer delusion required to maintain his arrogance while staring down a federal indictment was astonishing. "You are not going to call the police, William," I said, my tone completely devoid of any daughterly affection, "because the police are already on their way to investigate the $2 million mortgage fraud you committed this afternoon. And furthermore, you are not going to kick me out of your house because this is not your house." Beverly let out a sharp, hysterical squeak. "What are you talking about? We have lived in this North Shore estate for decades. This is the family mansion." I took a slow, deliberate step toward my mother. "Did you honestly believe grandmother would leave a $3 million estate to a man who squandered every single investment he ever touched?" I asked coldly. "She knew exactly what you and William were. She knew you were reckless, image-obsessed parasites who would sell the very roof over your heads to maintain a fake high society lifestyle." William's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. Before she died, I explained, my voice echoing clearly across the silent, devastated room. Grandmother placed this entire property into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. She legally transferred the absolute ownership of this estate, every single brick, every single chandelier, and every single inch of this imported Italian marble. She left it all to one specific beneficiary to protect the property from your massive debts. Beverly shook her head frantically. No, no, the lawyers said the estate was tied up in probate. They said we were managing the property. The lawyers lied to you, I stated flatly. They followed my explicit corporate instructions. I allowed you to live here rent-free. I allowed you to pretend you were wealthy socialites. I let you strut around this mansion playing king and queen because I pitied you. I kept my wealth entirely hidden because I knew you would attempt to drain my accounts just like you drained everyone else. But the legal truth is that I am the sole owner of this trust. I have always owned this house. You are nothing but my non-paying tenants. The ultimate crushing weight of reality finally shattered their entire universe. William staggered backward, clutching his chest, as if he were having a physical heart attack. Beverly collapsed onto the floor, her expensive designer dress soaking up the spilled wine, weeping uncontrollably, as the glorious, wealthy life she had faked for years instantly evaporated. Brittany stood completely paralyzed, her eyes darting between her sobbing, bankrupt husband and her federally indicted, impoverished parents. The golden child was suddenly surrounded by absolute ruins. Her Birkin bag sat forgotten on a chair, a meaningless piece of leather in a house she no longer had any right to occupy. I stood tall in the center of my magnificent $3 million dining room. The grand theatrical unveiling was complete. The false kings and queens had been stripped of their crowns, their stolen money, and their fake prestige. They were left with absolutely nothing but the terrifying, unescapable truth of their own destruction. The crushing silence that followed was violently broken by the loud thud of DeAndre dropping to his knees. The invincible venture capitalist, the man who had just threatened to throw me into the snow, collapsed onto the wine-soaked hardwood. He crawled forward, ignoring the shards of broken crystal biting through his expensive tailored trousers. He reached out his trembling hands, hovering just inches from my cheap winter boots, too terrified to actually touch me. "Caroline! Please!" DeAndre sobbed, his voice completely stripped of its former bass, reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Sister, I am begging you. It was a misunderstanding. You cannot do this to me. I will lose everything. My entire life is tied into those logistics contracts. If you kill the venture capital funding, I am bankrupt by tomorrow afternoon. They will liquidate my firm. They will take my cars, my assets, everything. I will be completely ruined." I stared down at him. The sheer whiplash of his shifting personality was revolting. Sister. He was actually invoking a familial bond he had spent the last 2 years treating like a contagious disease. A misunderstanding, I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue with freezing precision. "You mocked my career. You threw a $500 envelope at me like I was a beggar. You hurled horrific insults at my 5-year-old daughter and watched your wife physically assault her. Which part of that was a misunderstanding, DeAndre? Was it the part where you demanded we sleep in a freezing car, or the part where you called my child a bastard?" I was stressed. DeAndre wept, thick tears streaming down his face, completely ruining his curated image. The funding round had me on edge. I did not mean any of it. It was just a joke, Caroline. Just a stupid, arrogant joke. I will apologize to Lily. I will buy her anything she wants. Just log back into the portal. Please, I am begging you on my knees. Press the button and release the funds. You have billions. 10 million is nothing to you. It is my entire universe. Your universe was built on a foundation of unearned arrogance, I stated flatly. And my daughter is not for sale. The funding is permanently canceled. Prepare your bankruptcy filings. A loud, agonizing wail erupted from the other side of the dining room. Beverly was still on the floor, but the realization of her impending reality had finally bypassed her profound denial. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling over the hem of her ruined designer dress. She rushed toward me, her hands clasped together in front of her chest in a desperate gesture of prayer. "Caroline, my sweet girl," Beverly cried, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. "You have to call the bank. You have to call off the Federal Bureau of Investigation. William and I are in our 60s. We cannot go to federal prison. We would not survive it. The conditions, the shame, the absolute destruction of our social standing. You cannot send your own parents to jail. William followed her, moving with the sluggish, uncoordinated steps of a man walking to the gallows. He had completely deflated. The commanding, booming patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, frail old man facing the absolute certainty of his own criminal actions. He reached out his hands, shaking violently as he tried to grasp my arm. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing his hands to fall through empty air. We were desperate, Caroline. William pleaded, tears welling in his eyes for the first time in my entire life. DeAndre convinced us the startup was a guaranteed success. We just needed to provide the bridge loan to secure the investment. The bank required the property owner's signature. We thought we could secure the capital, pay off the loan in a few months when DeAndre went public, and you would never even know. We were trying to build a legacy for the whole family. You forged my signature on federal lending documents to steal $2 million from my trust. I countered, my voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room. You put a massive commercial lien on a property that belongs to me. You did not do this for the family. You did it to fund the golden child and her arrogant husband. You did it to maintain the illusion that you are wealthy elite socialites, while you are actually drowning in your own vanity. But blood is thicker than water, Beverly wailed, dropping to her knees right next to DeAndre. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my cardigan, her manicured nails digging into the cheap fabric she had insulted just an hour ago. We are your family, Caroline. You came from me. I raised you. You cannot just destroy us. Family forgives. Family protects each other. Blood is thicker than water. You have to save us. Please, I am begging you as your mother. Call the bank. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the loan. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. The woman who had just announced to a room full of relatives that I was a failure, who was being written out of the family legacy. The sheer hypocrisy of her invoking the concept of family protection was utterly nauseating. Blood is thicker than water, I repeated, looking down at my mother groveling on the floorboards. That is a very interesting phrase, Beverly. You certainly did not believe blood was thicker than water when you watched Brittany strike my child. You did not believe family protects each other when you ordered me out into a sub-zero blizzard on Christmas Eve. You told me that Christmas would be so much better without my poverty dragging you down. You made your priorities incredibly clear. I did not mean it. Beverly sobbed hysterically, her face buried in her hands. I was just angry. I was stressed. Please, Caroline. You meant every single syllable I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. You just never expected the person you were discarding to be the one holding the keys to the kingdom. You were perfectly happy to send me to a homeless shelter tonight. You were perfectly happy to let me freeze. The only reason you are crying now is because the federal authorities are coming to put you in handcuffs. William fell to his knees beside his wife. 3 people, the very people who had tortured me for decades, were now prostrate on the floor at my feet. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The arrogant tyrants were reduced to sniveling, terrified beggars. The scene was a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated karmic justice. I savored every single second of their complete and utter humiliation. The grand opulent dining room with its crystal chandeliers and custom silk drapery had been completely transformed into a courtroom of ultimate judgment. The air was no longer thick with their arrogance. It was heavy with the suffocating stench of their absolute desperation. They wept, they begged, and they groveled desperately, hoping to find a single shred of the obedient, submissive daughter they had manipulated for decades. They found nothing but an impenetrable wall of solid ice. I reached into the pocket of my cheap discount store cardigan. My fingers brushed past the encrypted corporate smartphone and wrapped around the thick, embossed white paper. I slowly pulled out the envelope DeAndre had so smugly slid across the mahogany table just an hour ago. The 5 crisp, brand-new $100 bills were still perfectly folded inside. DeAndre looked up at me through bloodshot, tear-filled eyes. His expensive, custom-tailored blazer was wrinkled and stained with the wine from the shattered glasses scattered across the floorboards. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. He watched my hand, perhaps harboring some delusional, pathetic sliver of hope that I was reaching for my phone to reverse the funding cancellation. Instead, I held the envelope out between my thumb and forefinger. I let it hover in the air for a brief, agonizing second before I simply let it go. The white envelope fluttered downward, landing softly, squarely on DeAndre's lap. "You gave me this earlier as an act of profound, high-class charity," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You told me not to spend it all at Walmart. I think you are going to need it much more than I do. Use this for your bankruptcy lawyer. You are going to need a very good one when the venture capital board sues you for breach of contract and massive corporate fraud tomorrow morning." DeAndre stared down at the envelope resting on his thighs. The $500, which had been a prop for his arrogant theatrical performance, was now his entire net worth. A fresh, agonizing sob tore from his throat. He buried his face in his hands completely, broken weeping with the raw, guttural intensity of a man who had just watched his entire universe burn to ashes. I shifted my gaze to Brittany. My golden sister had not joined her husband and parents on the floor. She remained frozen near the edge of the ruined dining table, clutching the back of a velvet chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Her pristine silk holiday dress was ruined, drenched in dark red wine. She looked absolutely terrified. "You wanted me to take my child and get out of your house," I told Brittany, my tone razor-sharp and lethal. "You were incredibly eager to banish us into the blizzard. But the reality is, Brittany, you possess absolutely nothing. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the elite social status, it was all funded by a man who is now completely destitute and secured by parents who are facing federal prison. You built your entire identity on the illusion of superiority. And now you have to face the real world with absolutely zero skills, zero money, and a husband facing total financial liquidation." Brittany opened her mouth, her lower lip trembling violently, but no words came out. The pampered, violent princess had been thoroughly stripped of her royal court. She was entirely defenseless. Finally, I looked down at William and Beverly. My parents were still kneeling on the hardwood floor, their faces stained with tears and absolute terror. They looked up at me, their eyes pleading silently for a miracle, for a sudden reversal of the horrific consequences they had brought upon themselves. "Caroline, please," Beverly whimpered, reaching out a trembling hand one last time. "We are your mother and father. You cannot just leave us like this." "I am not leaving you," I stated with absolute unwavering finality. "You left me. You left me the moment you decided my worth was tied to a bank account. You left me when you watched my daughter get physically assaulted and blamed her for bleeding on a dress. You left me when you forged my signature to steal $2 million from my trust. You sealed your own fate." I took a deliberate step back, fully removing myself from their desperate, grasping reach. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your belongings," I announced, my voice booming with undeniable authority. "Tomorrow evening, my corporate legal team is executing a formal eviction notice. The bank will permanently foreclose on this property due to the fraudulent encumbrance you attempted to file. The mansion will be sealed by private security. And shortly after that, the federal agents you triggered with your wire fraud will be arriving to place you both in handcuffs." William let out a horrifying, strangled gasp, clutching his chest, as if the air had been violently sucked from his lungs. Beverly collapsed entirely against the floorboards, screaming in pure, unrestrained terror. "Enjoy your last Christmas," I said, delivering the final lethal blow. I did not wait for another response. I did not need to hear another pathetic plea or another desperate excuse. The execution was complete. The absolute karma had been delivered with surgical precision. I turned my back on the people who had tortured me for my entire life. I walked over to the entryway where my beautiful 5-year-old daughter was standing quietly wrapped in her bright purple winter coat. She looked up at me, her dark eyes wide, but completely trusting. I smiled down at her, a genuine warm smile, filled with nothing but absolute, unconditional love. "Ready to go home, sweetie?" I asked softly. Lily nodded, slipping her small, warm hand into mine. "Yes, Mommy." We turned and walked toward the grand double doors. I reached out and pulled the heavy brass handle. The doors swung open, welcoming the freezing, howling winds of the Chicago blizzard. The cold air rushed over my face, but it did not feel biting or cruel anymore. It felt incredibly crisp, clean, and beautifully liberating. Behind me, the grand $3 million mansion echoed with the horrific sounds of absolute devastation. William was hyperventilating. DeAndre was sobbing uncontrollably, and Beverly was screaming in pure, unadulterated terror. The sounds of their ruined, shattered empire followed me out onto the grand porch. I stepped out into the snow, holding my daughter's hand tightly. I did not look back. I did not hesitate. I walked down the driveway past the useless, unpaid Porsche and toward my beat-up car. The storm was raging wildly around us, but for the first time in my entire existence, I was walking into the winter night completely free, utterly victorious, and completely untouchable. 3 months had passed since that chaotic Christmas Eve. The storm had eventually broken both the literal blizzard and the metaphorical hurricane that destroyed the foundation of my family's fraudulent empire. I stood by the expansive glass windows of my corner office at CL Holdings, watching the early spring sun glint off the skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. My reflection in the glass was of a woman who had finally shed the suffocating skin of the family scapegoat. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the absolute peace that comes with total vindication. The legal and financial fallout from that single night had been methodical, precise, and completely devastating. DeAndre's magnificent descent into absolute ruin happened faster than anyone could have predicted. The moment CL Holdings officially flagged his firm for fraudulent conduct, the entire venture capital ecosystem turned its back on him. His other investors, sensing the blood in the water, aggressively pulled their funding and triggered breach of contract clauses. Apex Freight Solutions was immediately forced into Chapter 7 liquidation. DeAndre lost everything. He lost the corporate leases, the luxury company cars, and the aggressive expansion contracts. But the financial collapse was only the beginning of his nightmare. During the liquidation audit, federal regulators discovered massive irregularities in DeAndre's corporate filings. He had intentionally inflated revenue projections and forged compliance documents to secure initial funding from smaller investors. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched a full-scale investigation, quickly followed by the Department of Justice. Last week, DeAndre was formally indicted on multiple counts of corporate fraud. He was currently out on bail, facing a very real possibility of serving 10 to 15 years in federal prison. The arrogant man who had proudly tossed $500 at me like peasant charity was now surviving on public defenders and the absolute terror of impending incarceration. Brittany, true to her incredibly shallow nature, did not stand by her husband during his darkest hour. The exact second the bank accounts were frozen and the luxury cars were repossessed, her profound, everlasting love for DeAndre instantly evaporated. She filed for divorce less than 48 hours after the FBI raided his corporate office. She desperately attempted to secure alimony and a massive settlement, completely oblivious to the fact that half of zero is still zero. The reality of being a divorced, bankrupt socialite hit Brittany with the force of a wrecking ball. With no assets, no marketable skills, and a reputation severely damaged by association, the golden child was forced to confront the harsh reality of the actual world. Her elite social circle immediately ostracized her. The very friends who used to covet her $15,000 designer handbags now refused to return her calls. Facing eviction from her luxury apartment, Brittany had no choice but to seek employment. I recently heard through a former mutual acquaintance that she is currently working the early morning shift at a discount retail store, spending her days folding cheap sweaters and steaming minimum wage garments. The poetry of her situation was not lost on me, but the most spectacular, thorough destruction belonged to William and Beverly. My parents' attempts to fight the fraud alert were completely pathetic. The paper trail was undeniable. They had blatantly forged my signature on federal lending documents and manipulated the trust protocols to secure the $2 million bridge loan. When the FBI agents arrived at the North Shore estate 3 days after Christmas, William and Beverly were placed in handcuffs and marched out the front door in full view of their wealthy, gossiping neighbors. It was the absolute ultimate destruction of their meticulously crafted social image. The legal proceedings were swift and merciless. Facing overwhelming evidence of wire fraud and mortgage fraud, they had no choice but to accept a plea deal to avoid spending their final decades behind bars. Because of their advanced age and lack of prior criminal history, the judge showed them a small shred of mercy. They avoided federal prison, but they were placed on strict, heavily monitored probation for the next 5 years. However, the financial penalties completely wiped them out. The court ordered massive restitution, forcing the immediate liquidation of any remaining assets they possessed. Their luxury cars, their expensive jewelry, and every single cent hidden in their checking accounts were seized. The bank permanently foreclosed on their massive consumer debts. They were unceremoniously evicted from the $3 million estate. The private security team I hired ensured they left with absolutely nothing but their personal clothing and a few basic necessities. The grand mahogany dining table where they had so proudly disinherited me was left behind completely irrelevant. William and Beverly now live in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The building is notorious for mold issues and unreliable heating. They survive entirely on their meager Social Security checks, clipping coupons, and counting every single penny. They are completely and utterly isolated. The wealthy friends they had spent decades impressing dropped them the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. No one wants to associate with convicted federal fraudsters. They spend their days trapped in a tiny, depressing box surrounded by the crushing weight of their own terrible choices. They had gambled everything on their own arrogance, completely convinced that they could manipulate, abuse, and steal without any consequences. They thought they could casually discard the daughter who did not fit their perfect elite narrative. They had demanded total war, and they had received absolute unyielding annihilation. I turned away from the massive window and walked back to my solid oak desk. I opened a folder containing the final closing documents for the sale of the North Shore estate. I had officially sold the mansion to a foreign investor just last week. The funds were immediately redirected into a secure high-yield trust account designated exclusively for Lily's future education and prosperity. The house that had represented nothing but toxicity and abuse was gone, transformed into a massive foundation of security for my innocent child. The ghosts of my past were permanently exorcised. The people who had tried to crush my spirit were living out the miserable consequences of their own creation. The scales of karma had balanced with absolute terrifying precision. I closed the folder, running my hand over the smooth leather cover. The storm was finally over. The skies were clear. It was time to focus entirely on the beautiful, unburdened future I had secured. 6 months later, the freezing, oppressive snowstorms of the Chicago North Shore felt like a distant, fated nightmare. I stood on the expansive wrap-around wooden balcony of a luxury chalet in Zermatt, high up in the breathtaking Swiss Alps. The air here was not biting or cruel. It was incredibly crisp, pure, and tasted of absolute freedom. The towering, majestic peak of the Matterhorn dominated the skyline, its jagged edges catching the brilliant golden light of the early morning sun. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing, taking a slow, deep breath of the pristine mountain air, feeling the profound, unshakable peace that had finally settled permanently into my soul. "Mommy, look at me!" A bright, joyous voice called out from the terrace behind me. I turned around and smiled. My beautiful daughter Lily was bundled up in a thick, custom-made thermal snowsuit. Her cheeks flushed a healthy rosy pink from the crisp mountain climate. She was holding a massive steaming mug of rich Swiss hot cocoa with both of her small gloved hands. A mountain of fluffy white marshmallows floated at the top, leaving a tiny, adorable smudge of chocolate foam right on the tip of her nose. She took a giant sip, closed her eyes in exaggerated delight, and let out a happy, contented sigh. "Is it the best hot cocoa in the entire world?" I asked, walking over and taking a seat on the plush, heated outdoor lounge chair next to her. "It is 1,000,000 times better than anything else," Lily declared confidently, taking another eager sip. I laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that came from the very bottom of my heart. I held my own mug, letting the soothing warmth radiate through my palms. I looked at my daughter, watching her swing her little legs happily over the edge of the chair. The bruised, terrified 5-year-old girl who had cried on a cold marble floor was completely gone. In her place was a confident, radiant child who knew she was unconditionally loved, fiercely protected, and entirely safe. That transformation alone was worth every single battle I had fought. The contrast between this glorious, peaceful morning and the toxic, agonizing Christmas Eve was staggering. We had traded the claustrophobic, suffocating atmosphere of an emotionally bankrupt family for the limitless, majestic horizon of the Swiss Alps. I had not just removed the toxic elements from our lives, I had completely eradicated them from our reality. Before we boarded our private jet to fly to Switzerland, I took one final necessary step to permanently seal the fortress around my peace. I changed my phone number. I changed my private email addresses. I instructed my corporate security team to permanently block any digital, physical, or legal correspondence originating from William Beverly Brittany or DeAndre. The sale of the mansion had severed their final financial tie to my existence, but blocking their access severed the psychological chain. They were no longer my parents, my sister, or my brother-in-law. They were simply strangers living out the harsh, miserable consequences of their own spectacular arrogance. They could no longer reach me. They could no longer hurt me. They simply ceased to exist in my universe. As I sat there looking out over the snow-capped peaks, I realized something incredibly profound about the journey I had taken. For years, I had allowed my biological family to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to force me into the role of the quiet, suffering scapegoat, because I mistakenly believed that enduring their cruelty was the price of admission for familial love. I had built a billion-dollar corporate empire in secret because I was terrified of their greed. But I had still shown up to their dinners, cooked their meals, and tolerated their abuse, hoping that one day they might finally see my value. I took a slow sip of my hot cocoa, letting the rich warmth settle in my chest. I had been looking at the entire concept of family completely wrong. Never let anyone measure your value by your capacity to endure their abuse. Walking away isn't quitting, it's cleaning house. That was the ultimate lesson. I had not failed as a daughter or a sister. They had failed as human beings. I had spent my entire life trying to survive a burning building when I should have just walked out the front door and let the arsonists deal with the flames. Walking away from them was the single most empowering, terrifying, and brilliant decision I had ever made. I had taken a massive broom and swept out decades of generational trauma, financial parasitism, and emotional manipulation. I looked over at Lily, who was now busy trying to catch falling snowflakes on her tongue. The greatest legacy I was leaving her was not the massive trust fund secured by the sale of the North Shore estate. It was not the multi-billion-dollar logistics empire she would eventually inherit. The greatest, most vital legacy I was giving my daughter was the absolute certainty that she never had to tolerate disrespect from anyone, regardless of whether they shared her blood. She would grow up knowing that her voice mattered, her boundaries were sacred, and her peace was non-negotiable. We were going to spend the next 2 weeks skiing, exploring the alpine villages, and making memories that were entirely our own. We were going to build new holiday traditions, free from the dark, heavy shadow of people who measured love with a price tag. The empire I had built was finally serving its true purpose. It was protecting my family, the real family consisting of me and my daughter, from a cruel, bitter world. The sky above the Matterhorn was a brilliant, endless expanse of crystal-clear blue. There were no storms on the horizon. There were no arrogant voices demanding my submission. There was only the gentle whistling of the alpine wind, the sweet sound of my daughter's laughter, and the brilliant, undeniable warmth of a future that belonged entirely to us. Have you ever had to use your own hidden success to crush the arrogance of a toxic family member? Tell me your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of Caroline's harrowing Christmas Eve masterfully illustrates a profound truth about human relationships. Enduring abuse is never the required currency for familial love. For years, Caroline subjected herself and her innocent daughter to relentless degradation. She intentionally hid her immense corporate success simply to navigate a family dynamic built entirely on conditional affection, superficial status, and financial parasitism. Society often conditions us to believe that shared blood automatically dictates endless loyalty, even when that loyalty explicitly requires us to shrink our potential mask, our achievements, or silently endure blatant disrespect. The ultimate lesson embedded in this narrative is that walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of surrender, it is the ultimate victory of self-preservation. Caroline's profound realization that she was desperately trying to survive inside a burning building instead of simply walking out the front door serves as a powerful metaphor. It speaks directly to anyone trapped in a destructive cycle. True empowerment materializes the exact moment you stop waiting for abusers to suddenly recognize your inherent value and instead choose to fiercely validate it yourself. By dismantling the illusion of her parents' superiority and firmly shutting the door on their unrelenting greed, Caroline protected far more than her physical assets. She safeguarded her peace of mind and ensured her daughter would never inherit a legacy of emotional subjugation. She demonstrated that building a beautiful, secure, and authentic life sometimes requires deliberately demolishing the rotten foundations of the past. Real healing begins when you decide that your dignity is absolutely non-negotiable. Take a thorough inventory of the relationships in your own life, firmly establish your boundaries, and bravely remove anyone who demands your self-respect as their price of admission.